Professor Joshua Landis, the director of the Center for the Middle East at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome to Al-Arabiya, sir.
It's a pleasure. Pleasure being with you.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, starting first with Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura, who is visiting Syria this week upon an invitation from the Syrian government. Do you see any possibility that they will agree on the third group suggested by the United Nations as the expert independent group from the other two groups, the opposition and the government, and to reach some sort of a workable solution for this third group? Do you see this as a possibility?
Frankly, I don't see it as a big possibility. I think that the Assad team will just try to delay this. They're going to stonewall. They see de Mistura now as a lame duck, that he doesn't have much power. They're not going to give him anything that he hasn't gotten already. And I don't believe that Assad is very interested in having a bunch of, outside experts and Syrian opposition people writing a new constitution for Syria. He has won this war. And he feels that he's not going to give an inch on this UN thing. I can't see him making any deep compromises.
So if the Constitutional Committee is dead at its arrival, does that mean the whole peace process or the negotiating track through Geneva is dead?
Well, it's certainly on life support. We've seen in the Idlib deal and the last negotiations have all been run around the Astana process. That was a process put together by the Russians, Turks, and Iranians, and they're the ones who've been negotiating the peace in Idlib and other compromises. So the UN, the United States, Western Europe, has largely dealt itself out of the present negotiations. So it's hard to see where they're going to gain traction. The United States hopes that it's going to gain some traction by retaining the north of Syria, the largely Kurdish part, but also Raqqa and other Arab parts on the north of the Euphrates, as well as Tanf, blocking the highway, the main highway between Damascus and Baghdad, stopping trade. By impoverishing Assad's government, the United States believes that Russia will be eventually forced to come back to the UN process, have elections that will lead to Assad departing Syria. That's the talking points of the Americans. It's hard to see that will ever work out that way because Assad feels very confident, and Russia seems quite confident that they can put Syria back together again. But that's the American plan, and that could lead sanctions and economic deprivation could lead to future regime change in Syria.
Were you surprised by Staffan de Mistura declaring his resignation from his position at the last week of November? And why do you think he is leaving this position?
Well, he's lasted a long time. We saw the first two UN envoys, Kofi Annan and then the Algerian Akhdar Brahimi, who both had short tenures. They tried to push for some kind of negotiated peace, but they abandoned the situation, threw up their arms and said, look, the two sides are too far apart. This is hopeless. So de Mistura has been around for a long time now. He really didn't aspire to bringing peace to Syria, but he did work hard at small negotiations where there were, especially at the end, where various areas like Douma and Daraa were giving in. And the UN played a vital role in trying to move people out, fighters out to Idlib and other places in the north, provide assurances, buses, and some kind of oversight of the peace of these negotiating process. So it played a minor role, but an important role.
But why did he give up now?
Well, I think that the war is largely over, and we've seen a lot of people, news agencies, begin to leave Syria. and begin to turn away their gaze from Syria. The opposition fighters have been really hanging up their guns and either going to Turkey or trying to reconcile. There isn't a big future for the revolution, and it looks like this has largely been solved on the battlefield. Of course, there's Idlib and the east of the Euphrates that still are a big question mark, but the UN is not playing a big role. So I think he sees this as the end of a process and that it's time for him to retreat. He says he's doing this for personal reasons. He's over 70 years old, so it makes sense that this is the end of a long career with the UN and an illustrious career.
So for all intents and purposes, you are declaring the death of the Syrian revolution?
I'm afraid so. It really does seem that way. The effort of the revolutionaries to overturn the Assad regime and to start anew in Syria has come to naught. And the regime is still powerful, it's in place, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So in that sense, yes, the revolution is over.
And the financing has stopped from all sides to the rebels and to the Free Syrian Army and to opposition. Isn't that true?
Yes, that's a very important point, because that is really, everybody has given up on the opposition. The Saudis have stopped financing. The United States called off its financing under Trump, and Turkey, I think, has largely finished its effort. Nobody sees a future success in the opposition. So the financing is gone, and that means really that there's only one, there's one army on the battlefield, and that's Assad's army.
What do you think of de Mistura's sort of big move when he offered to go to Idlib and lead the fighters out to safety? But that offer went nowhere. Didn't that expose the limitation of the traction of and the influence of the United Nations?
Well, you're absolutely right. De Mistura, at the height of the Idlib crisis, when everybody thought that the Assad regime with the Russians was going to attack and lead to a big humanitarian wave of refugees flowing into Turkey, and a terrible situation where many people could have been killed, de Mistura said, I will personally go into Idlib and try to open a passageway into Syria where civilians could go into Syria. The opposition hated this idea. They condemned de Mistura. They said he was an agent of Assad, and this was going to lead the people to slaughter. And the United States didn't really back it. It didn't get international traction, and it went nowhere. The Astana process, Turkey, Russia, came up with a formula where this buffer zone was created, and in a sense, the UN was again put at the sideline. And I think for de Mistura, that was in a sense a not a wake-up call, but it was his swan song, his effort to contribute. And when it didn't work, it led him to think that perhaps it was time to retire.
There are names mentioned here at the United Nations to replace him, such as Nikolai Mladenov, the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Peace Process in the Middle East, and Jan Kopic, who is the Special Envoy to Iraq and the head of UNAMI, and who's leaving very, very soon. But there are also names like the former Algeria Foreign Minister Ramtan Al-Amamra, and now actually there is a frontrunner being mentioned who is Geir Pedersen, who was Norway's ambassador here. We know him very well here at the United Nations. Now he is the Norwegian ambassador to China, and there's a lot of talk that he will be taken over, or the Algerian former foreign minister. What do you hear? Is anything that you heard that confirm what we hear here at the United Nations?
Well, it's true. Peterson is well liked by everybody. He cut his teeth on the Oslo Accords way back in the 90s, and he's been an important player ever since. The Americans seem to like him, and so does the head of the UN. The British, French also support him. So he has,
and the Chinese support,
and the Chinese as well. So he has important support. And that may just carry the day. And I don't, you know, this job is a difficult one. Going into this position of trying to be a negotiator for peace is not going to be easy, because the US and Russia are at loggerheads over Syria. There is really very little agreement. The US is hoping still to force Assad out of Damascus. The Russians are determined to keep him there. It's not clear that the UN will be in any UN envoy will be in a position to gain real compromise on this issue from either side.
So realistically speaking, can the UN or any envoy, whether it's Peterson or Al-Amamra or Nikolai Miladinov or Jan Kupish, can lead a process whereby a Syrian constitution is written and UN leading elections under its auspices in Syria? Is that at all a possibility in your opinion?
You know, I don't believe that regime change is going to be led by the UN. Where the UN can play an important role, of course, is the ongoing Idlib problem. And if there are refugees to come out of Idlib, what to do with the fighters who are stuck there. Many of these jihadist fighters are going to have to either be attacked by Russia and Assad, or they're going to have to find some kind of refuge elsewhere. The Turks are going to play a big role in that, but the UN could play a role. The UN is also very important for any rebuilding of Syria. And we've already seen that the neighborhood is beginning to bring Syria back in. The Bahraini foreign minister gave a big bear hug on camera with lots of different news agencies there just a few weeks ago to the Syrian foreign minister. Kuwait, Kuwaiti newspapers give an important interview with Assad, who is very glowing about Kuwait's constant friendship. And we've seen, in a sense, Assad is once again being integrated into the region. They've asked to be brought back into the Arab League. That's going to take time, obviously. But even Saudi Arabia, which was so determined to get rid of Assad, wants stability in the region. Syria is going to find its way back in, and the UN will be key to any process of rebuilding and developing an economic future for the region. And Syria is key. It's key to Jordan's future. It's key to Lebanon's future. It's key to the future of Iraq. The trade, the tourism, the transit of oil, it's all important.
So do you see President Assad of Syria playing a waiting game to gain full control?
You know, Talal, I think that's exactly what he's doing. He believes that if he just sits tight, eventually relations are going to have to be normalized in the region. He's too important. Geographically, Syria is too important.
The Americans, they are very, very keen in defeating ISIS, and most of the effort is directed in that direction. Do you really consider ISIS defeated in Syria to no return?
You know, as a territorial state, I believe it is defeated. But as a terrorist organization, and an organization that holds up an important ideological demand, which is a caliphate, which is an Islamic government, it's not going to go away. We've seen fighters attack various towns in the east, and in Iraq, the same thing. Now, right now, ISIS is in complete chaos. They're reforming and trying to repurpose themselves. But we've already seen ISIS fighters going to Libya, Yemen. There are many other failed states. And the future of Afghanistan looks very, at least the future for America and American government looks bleak at this time. America's carrying out negotiations with the Taliban, but the Taliban are in the driver's seat. And they've been taking back Afghan territory step by step. So ISIS has many places that it can go to and try to rebuild, as long as the Middle East is in such
turmoil,
such dire straits, with an economy that cannot feed its people and where there's not enough good jobs for young people. ISIS is going to hold a torch, and that's the unfortunate truth, it seems.
The Syrian government announced this week its budget. They announced a budget of $8.9 billion. It did not even reach $9 billion. How would you describe such a small budget for a country emerging from 8 years of civil war and needs to do a lot of reconstructions? And they actually allocated $110 million only in this budget for reconstructions. Can you give me your thoughts, please?
Boy, it's a sobering number, because Jordan, just next door, has a budget of $9 billion. And that's a country that's less than half the size of Syria. Syria is 20 million people. Jordan, is less than 10 million. Lebanon, a country of 5-6 million people, has a budget that's even bigger than Jordan's and Syria's. So Syria is just hobbling along. Now, of course, this is, the revolution is, or the civil war is still going on. And this budget is $1.5 billion more than last year's budget. So Syria is digging its way forward, and they just opened important highway to Jordan, and the Nasib crossing there, that used to carry $2 billion worth of trade back and forth between Lebanon through Damascus to Jordan every year. They're opening up and negotiating with Iraq to open up more trade in those directions. Now, of course, the Americans are going to stop that at Tanf and so forth. But by and large, Syria is beginning to put its economy back. Sanctions, of course, have it hobbled. The banking sector is in a deep swoon, and the Lebanese banks, which had been hoping to open up the spigots and begin to rebuild in Syria, haven't been able to do so. So there's still a lot that needs to be done.
But we all know that the Americans, the Western world, the Europeans, and possibly the Gulf states are not going to contribute to reconstructions of Syria after the war. So $110 million, does that mean the reconstruction is not going to happen?
It's going to happen on the backs of the individual people. People are going to have to work hard and draw on their savings and have people send money from outside and rebuild their houses. It's going to happen at a snail's pace, and it's going to be largely, the onus is going to be on private sector to come forward and begin to rebuild slowly. It's going to take a long time. And that's that's the price, really, of this Cold War that's going on in the Middle East, not only between Shiites and Sunnis, but it been between Russia and America. And it's hard to see much reconciliation. There isn't a lot of reconciliation between Syrians, the opposition and the Syrian government, or anywhere. There is such conflict that remains between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Now we see it, that it's hard to really get everybody to work together to begin to reinvest money and to rebuild. And it's going to be a slow, difficult process, but it will happen.
I would like to move now to a report issued by Amnesty International this week about Raqqa and what's happening in Raqqa. And they are saying that after 1 year, things hasn't really improved much after all this time. And many were expected the United States to chip in and help in improving the situation in Raqqa. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The Trump administration had originally inherited almost $300 million, which were supposed to be spent by the State Department and other agencies in northern Syria for stabilization, rebuilding. Trump said, we're not going to do that. And he went out, hat in hand, to the Saudis and other Gulf countries and said, you have to pay for this. This is the Middle East. We've done the heavy lifting with the fighting and the coalition against ISIS. You pay. And one of the things that just happened is that in Pompeo's visit this last week to Saudi Arabia is that the Saudis finally released $100 million of that money to the State Department and the coalition that is in charge of North Syria. So there will be $100 million. There has been other money go there, but you're right. Raqqa is in shambles. There is almost no rebuilding. Electricity is coming back to the town, but you look at the video of it, it's one broken down building after the next. And that's true across Syria. It's going to be a very slow process. The United States is not going to spend money doing it, and I don't think the Europeans will either. The Saudis have, but begrudgingly. They're not really interested in building North Syria. And Turkey is furious at America's position. They believe this money is going to go to Kurds who are related to the PKK, and it's going to end up igniting rebellion in eastern Turkey. So there are a lot of reasons why rebuilding is going very slowly, because people don't want to invest in the region. They're worried about future wars and trouble.
How do you see American policy towards Syria shaping in the future? And will the American forces ever withdraw before seeing the Iranian forces and their militias off Syria?
Well, that's the big question. And it does seem that the Trump administration has really clarified its position, that it's not going to withdraw until Iran withdraws. But the likelihood of Iran withdrawing from Syria is almost zero. The Iranians have said they're not going to do it. Assad has said they're invited guests, and he needs them. He needs Iran's backing. So that's not likely to happen. The Americans are likely to stay in northern Syria for the next 2 years, at least as long as Trump is in power. If he wins elections again in 2 years, it could be for another 4 years. It doesn't cost the United States a lot of money to be in the north. And so it could go on for some time. Now, of course, Turkey, Iran, and Russia have all sort of come together to announce that they want the Americans to leave, and they're going to begin to put pressure on the United States in northern Syria. But it's unclear how much pressure they will really place. And that's going to be a sore spot. I do believe that eventually America will withdraw. Assad can play this waiting game. There are 2.5 million Kurds in northern Syria, and they have traditionally been the poorest and most underdeveloped population and region of Syria. So to develop it into a going nation that can defend itself without outside protection is a very difficult task. It would take decades to do. And of course, it has many opponents. None of the governments in the region want to see an independent Kurdish state in northern Syria. So for that reason, I think America will pull out eventually, not under this administration. And that's what Assad will wait for.
Professor Joshua Landis, the Director of Center for the Middle East at the University of Oklahoma, we thank you for your thoughts and for this interview. Thank you so much indeed.
Well, Mr. Al-HAJ, it's a pleasure and wonderful questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.